Yeah, so this is my first year at Essex. I taught for 12 years at West Virginia University, and taught for 2 years before that at Southern Illinois University in the state of Illinois. Does anyone know where West Virginia is, roughly? No. But does anyone know where Virginia is? So you do have some sense where West Virginia is, if you know where Virginia is, in the Appalachian Mountains. I did my PhD at UCLA in Southern California and finished in 1997. So it's kind of a mid-career move for me to come here, but I do European history, and so in my archives, historians for the most part, when they do historical research, they go into libraries and they go into archives, which are places where old documents are stored. And the archives that I use, since I deal with the history of France and the history of Italy, are in Europe, so it's a lot closer for me to be here. So that's a good part of the reason why I decided to come. Plus, this department, if you're interested in this time period and this subject matter, it's actually a very good department. There are a number of scholars who are working on the history of the period between the end of the Middle Ages and the 18th century or so. So there's a nice atmosphere. If you want to do some work or do some research or learn more about that time period, then it's actually a good place to be. I thought that I'd say a few things today, and then have a little discussion also based on a primary source that we'll look at about the topic of kinship in pre-modern Europe, families and power in early modern Europe. Here you've got some topics I wanted to talk about in a general sense about the relationship between families and power, how family power is reproduced, what are some limitations to family interests in European history generally. Okay, so we'll be going back to look at these questions in a broad sense, and then focus in on the period of European history between the Renaissance and the 18th century or so. What were some limitations to family interest over time? We'll take a look at a case study, the Medici family, and then we'll, has anyone heard of this family before? The Medici? Raise your hand if you've heard of them. No. All right. From Italy, from the city of Florence. Has anyone been to Florence before? Has anyone been to Italy before? Okay. Did you go to Florence? Naples, Rome, and Venice. Oh, well, that's a good selection already. Yeah, so the Medici were an important family in Florence. We'll talk about them. And then I want to say something about the situation during the Enlightenment. Enlightenment, when we think about the Enlightenment, usually we think about the 18th century, so 1700s. So we'll look at how, in some ways, the situation changed then. And here we've got just a couple of different family crests. These were symbols that families, noble families and families that wanted to be noble, used in order to demonstrate their power, their prestige. This one is of the Medici family in Florence. So what these 6 balls are, you see that if you go to Florence and visit, you'll see that image or that symbol all over the place. This one here, might be kind of hard to make out. Can you see the slide from where you are? There's 2 fleur de lis. Have you seen that symbol before? Lilies. And it's a symbol that we often associate with France. In this case, it's a symbol that was granted to a family called the Fuggers. Maybe you saw that film with Ben Stiller, Meet the Fuggers. Just kidding. It's a different name. But the Fuggers is a family from southern Germany. They were a banking family. They're remarkable because of their rapid rise. In the end of the 1300s, it was a family from a small town near the town of Augsburg, so like a village. And the guy, the head of the family, was a weaver. And within about 30 or 40 years, the family moved to the city of Augsburg and got involved in the textile trade, trading wool and cloth, and started to make money. And within 60 or 70 years, the family grew to be one of the wealthiest family in Augsburg, one of the wealthiest in Germany. And within maybe 20 years after that, they were the wealthiest family in Europe, lending money to the Holy Roman Emperor and to other rulers. So it was the rise of the Fuggers took place very rapidly. So anyway, that's their family crest. If you go to Augsburg, you can see, has anyone been to Germany in the room? Yeah? You didn't go to Augsburg though, did you? It's actually a nice town in southern Germany, not too far from Munich. This last crest is of the House of Savoy, which was a family that was ruling in what is today France and what is in Italy, and they came into being in the Middle Ages and acquired lands in the Alps, in the mountains, in these different alpine valleys. Someone's probably been skiing in France before. Has anyone been skiing in France? Where'd you go skiing? Courchevel is in the lands ruled by the House of Savoy. Yeah, because it's in Savoie. You probably recognize that name, Savoie. Over time, this family acquired more and more territory. They acquired lands on the other side of the Alps, on the Italian-speaking side. They made the city of Turin their capital. Has anyone ever heard of something called the Shroud of Turin? Have you heard of it? The Shroud of Turin? The Shroud of Turin was this, it's a relic, and the family claimed and others claimed was placed over the body of Jesus when Jesus was taken down from the cross and put into the tomb. They placed this shroud like a sheet over him, and then it was said that later somehow this shroud miraculously turned up in the possession of some family in the Middle Ages, and when you look at it, you see the picture of a face, a human face, and kind of an outline of a body with blood marks in places where Jesus was said to have been pierced by the spear of the soldier and so forth. You've probably seen the picture, I would imagine. Anyway, the Shroud of Turin was acquired by this family as a dynastic relic. So that is, it was this object that was said to be powerful and spiritually important, and it was owned by the family, so people would come and see it, and it's one of those things that gave the family more prestige. Anyway, these rulers of Savoy, over time, acquired more and more territory, and in the 19th century, when Italy unified and became a united country, because before that it was a bunch of independent states, and in 1860, Italy became a united country. It did so under the leadership of this family. They became kings of Italy. So it's actually it was the longest ruling family. They ruled in Italy until 1949. It was the longest ruling family in European history. Anyway, so those are just some examples of a few families. But let me start here with kind of a basic introduction to the idea of families in power. And the first point that I want to make is that in the early modern, well, in pre-modern Europe, before there were centralized states or nation states, the key ruling unit was families. Okay, and so this was true not only for Europe, but also for other places in the world, societies across the globe. And it's kind of a thought experiment that we need to do. Because we're so used to, when we think about power and politics, we're so used to thinking about states, right? England as a nation state, or Russia, or Germany, or China, right? We're used to thinking about about power and politics in these terms of nation states with boundaries and so on. So what we have to do is think back before those things existed, and then ask ourselves the question, where was power located? And it was located in families, really. This is a map of the Holy Roman Empire, which is much of what is today Germany and some lands in Central Europe. And I'm using it just for purposes of illustration because it shows you the kind of fragmentation. See all these little areas, these little dots, these little splotches. Those were lands ruled for the most part by families during the Middle Ages. And some of these lands were actually combinations of places ruled by different families. So if we actually had a map of places ruled by families, it would be even more fragmented. But it gets us, I think, more into the mindset. It helps us to understand this image. It helps us to understand better what it was like, how confused and overlapping the structure of power was in Europe in the pre-modern period. So European politics really was rooted in the concept of lordship. And lordship has to do with the head of a family exercising authority over a certain territory. Lordship means that he's got, the Lord has some followers, some armed followers, knights who are in his retinue. And the idea, the goal of each of these families ruled by a lord was to acquire as much territory and influence as possible in competition with other families. Okay, so it's families battling it out with each other. That was the rule of politics in pre-modern Europe. So this is an old idea that goes back to ancient times, and if anthropologists are right, even to prehistoric times. So this concept of families in conflict with each other, we can see it in classical literature. So in ancient Greek and Roman literature, we see politics described in these terms. If you look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Bible, you can also see politics described in those terms. And anthropologists, people who study ancient societies, have also found similar things. So in order to appreciate how this kind of world operated, we need to think about a world in which people's identities were collective and not individual. And this is another thing that's weird for us, because our world today is so strongly based on the autonomy of the individual, right? Our political system is based on the notion of individual rights, right? But in the past, in the pre-modern world, that didn't compute for people. They thought about their identities as collective. They thought about themselves as being part of something bigger than just themselves as an individual. Of course, that doesn't mean that individual family members didn't sometimes have desires that conflicted with the desires of the head of the family. That happened, and we'll talk about that in a second in more detail. But by and large, people's identities were collective, so it's a different kind of world. So I want to say something about how families played this game. If the idea of politics was a struggle between families for more territory, for more authority, and they were fighting with each other all the time, how did they preserve and increase family wealth and authority over time? Over time, which is another thing that's interesting. Families, these kinds of families in the pre-modern world, they weren't just thinking about their immediate concerns. They were also thinking, how can my family have influence in the next generation and the generation after that? So this question of how the family works over time was also important to them. So that has to do, obviously, with producing children, right? So they need to figure out how they can produce children. Well, they knew how to do that, but they need to understand how they could do this in a way that gave children the authority, the tools to compete over time. All right? And so this is a picture of a French anthropologist named Claude Lévi-Strauss, who studied pre-modern societies, obviously in the 20th century, but he went to different parts of the world, places that were outside of the West and that had social structures and interactions that had not been really affected by modernity. And he analyzed them. And one thing that he found, he wrote an essay called The Elementary Structures of Kinship. The Elementary Structures of Kinship. So he's interested in the basics of kinship and how it came to be organized. And he found that families chose marriage partners from other families in order to avoid something called the incest taboo, which he found existed in all of these different societies. That is, families knew how to make children, but routinely they didn't do it with people in their own family, right? They needed to find partners from other families. They decided to do that. So this incest taboo, he said, led to a reciprocal exchange of women between two families. So you have two families that want to reproduce, and so they decided to exchange daughters, and this created a relationship, an alliance between the two families. So daughters were given out in marriage, and other daughters were received. And here I just would note that when you talk about exchanging daughters, it does kind of make it sound like it's like you're trading cattle or something, right? Is that what you were thinking? Yeah. So we have this, there's obviously a critique of this notion of trading daughters. But what I want to suggest is that in a way, it's a perspective that's anachronistic. Do you guys know that word, anachronistic? Anachronistic? Something that's anachronistic. An example of an anachronism would be, I don't know, a film in which you have Abraham Lincoln talking on the telephone, right? Because telephones didn't exist during the lifetime of Abraham Lincoln. So taking an idea or a concept or a thing from one period and then projecting it into the past where it didn't exist for people, it wouldn't have been real, that's an anachronism. So when I suggest that this feminist critique of this reciprocal exchange of daughters is anachronistic, I mean that those daughters and the people exchanging and the families involved, they didn't have that notion of individual identity that we do. And so I think that we have to understand this exchange taking place within a logic of kinship relations and a logic of establishing the family position. So daughters, when they were exchanged, brought with them resources from their birth family. Okay, so you have two families, and they're exchanging daughters so they can produce children. And the daughter that goes to the other family brings with her something that's of value, maybe some land, to the new family as part of the alliance. Does anyone know what that's called? A dowry, right? So daughters bring with them dowries, both to provide for their own well-being and also as part of their inheritance. Okay? So here I've talked about dowries, there you have the word. So here I've mentioned two things. Inheritance and alliances with other families. In a world in which wealth and influence is rooted in agriculture and agricultural production, controlling land was the main concern of families. Okay? Wealth and influence is rooted in agriculture in the pre-modern world. And so families, if they want to win in this game that they're playing with each other, they want to be able to control land. The primary mechanism by which control of land was acquired was inheritance. Okay? This is the central way in which family power passes from one generation to the next. So the question is, how do families protect their power over time? Well, it happens through inheritance and through controlling land. That means that the inheritance practices, forms of inheritance, were really important, were really crucial if we want to understand family power. What were the rules governing inheritance? And these rules varied from place to place. There were complicated reasons related to the nature of the kind of land that existed in a certain area, what kinds of things were grown, what kind of labor was needed to produce those things, tradition, all kinds of different rules govern inheritance. In some places, women could inherit, so that wasn't out of the question. In other places, women inherited through their dowry. The Latin term is exclusio propter doptem, which means that women are excluded from the inheritance after they've received their dowry. Basically, the dowry is serving as their part of the inheritance. So, when families made these marriage alliances, one of the things that they had to balance actually a number of factors. And one of the things that they looked at was the value of the land to be acquired through a dowry. And the value of the land could be related to a number of different things. It might have to do with the amount of the land in question, right? It might have to do with the productivity of the land, the kind of land, right? So if I don't know, maybe I'm going to make an alliance with some family and they say, well, we're going to give you 50 acres, but it turns out that the 50 acres is an old parking lot, right? And then somebody else is going to give me 10 acres, and the 10 acres is wonderfully productive land near a river that's irrigated and so on. Right? The 10 acres might be better than the 50 acres. So the kind of land, the productivity of the land, its geopolitical relevance might be important. So here there's a picture, there's an image of a castle. This is in northern Italy in an area called the Trentino. And here you can see that there's a castle, there's a lake down here, which was a reservoir. It was dammed up, so usually there, in the Middle Ages there was just a stream down there. But you can see across the way that there's a village, a bunch of farmland around it, and then some mountains, and then there are a couple of passes that go over those mountains to another valley on the other side. So from the perspective of the family living in this castle, what they might be more interested in than a large quantity of land is some land located in a place where that could allow them to dominate this village, or maybe that's located in a pass so that they could govern communication between this area and the valley, one valley over. So there were those kinds of concerns also were involved when it came to marriage alliances. The kinds of rights that land conferred. In the Middle Ages, land wasn't the way, today property is property. In the Middle Ages, different kinds of lands might have had rights that go along with it. So if I hold a certain piece of property, I might also hold the right to judge disputes that occur within that property, or to collect revenues from that property. Okay, so those are the kinds of things also that families had to, during the pre-modern period, think about and balance. The political benefits of alliance. If I'm making an alliance with another family, is that a family that is well connected? What kind of influence do they have? Will this alliance consolidate a pre-existing alliance? Those are also issues that came up. And I didn't even mention the people involved, the young men and the young women involved, or older men or older women. So maybe there's an older woman who's a widow, and she stands and she's going to bring property that's important to me, but I have questions about her ability to produce an heir. That might be something that I take into account. Or the reverse. Maybe she's younger, she doesn't have much property, but I think she's going to produce a lot of heirs. So when you think about it in detail, what kinds of things families had to balance out when they made these alliances, it could be very complicated. All right, I'm going to shift gears here and say something about ways in which families that were trying to make these deals with each other faced obstacles or limitations. And I'm going to go back to ancient times and then look over the course of the Middle Ages and early modern period. Here you've got an image, a 14th century image depicting a secret marriage. The other word for secret marriage is clandestine marriage. All right. So the church in European history was an institution that limited the power of family leaders in a few different ways as far as marriage and inheritance were concerned. Okay, so the church in a way is putting some brakes on what families can do. One thing that the church did is that it required the consent of the marriage partners. Okay, so a father, a lord is trying to arrange a marriage. The church declared from early on that the young people had to agree, and if they didn't agree, if they didn't consent, it was not a valid marriage. So that actually gave some leverage to the women and the men involved. So according to canon law, fathers could not force children to marry against their will. So that was one obstacle that the church posed to the heads of these families. Another obstacle is that the church viewed clandestine marriage as valid. Right? If a child, if two young people wanted to get married and they went out and they exchanged promises, I marry you, I accept you as wife, I marry you, I accept you as husband, and then the marriage is consummated, in the eyes of the church, that's a valid marriage. Right? But you can see how fathers would be going crazy, and other family members, that would drive them bananas, right? Because they've got these other interests at play. So they're trying to work out they want to increase the power of the family over time, acquire more property, make political alliances, and then these kids are going off and marrying, maybe without doing things that, let's say, making matches that don't fit into the family strategy. That could be a problem. But the church viewed these marriages as valid. That was another obstacle. And the third obstacle created by the church is that it adopted a series of rules beginning in about the 4th century that had the effect of limiting the production of heirs. So the church said, for example, that one of the most important rules limiting the production of heirs had to do with incest, right? And we talked about the incest taboo. The church defined incest in a different way. The church defined incest in terms of degrees of separation. So if you've got, let's say, okay, you've got these parents and these children, all right? And let's say that here you've got two brothers, and then they've got other children over here. So these people are cousins, right? First cousins. For the church, incest had to do, there were different ways, it's kind of complicated because there were different ways of measuring what constituted a degree of separation. But typically it was a relationship between one person, whether it's a sibling relationship or a father-son, mother-daughter relationship. So these two people would be separated by 1, 2, 3 degrees. Okay? So they're first cousins. So according to the rule of the church that if incest is defined as separation by 4 degrees, then these people could not get married. Okay? If this person ends up having some children, then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Still can't get married. Sorry. But if this if this person then has some children, then these two people are separated by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if incest is defined in terms of separation by 4 degrees, then these people can get married because they're separated by 5. Do you see how that works? So originally, the church, though, ended up, and this changed over time. At a certain point, the rule was incest is separation by 7 degrees. Okay? So this wouldn't work. These guys would have to have kids. These guys here are second cousins, right? They would have to have children, and they would be who are separated by even more. Why did the church have these rules? The different reasons, but the main one is that the church had this idea of wanting marriage to be something that brought different families together and created a community. They didn't want to see these kinds of first cousin marriages happening all the time because they thought that it would end up with family groupings that were closed, that were only concerned about each other. and that we're not open to others. Do you see the theoretical desire of the church to make a community in which people from different families are interacting with each other and sharing with each other? Of course, from the perspective of the fathers, from the lords, from the heads of the household, cousin marriage is wonderful. Why? Do you think? Well, I know it sounds weird to us, but I think it's legal in England. So, if you've had your eye on your cute cousin, I'm just kidding. Why would think about the logic of inheritance? What does cousin marriage allow you to do?
They keep stuff within the family.
Within the family, right? You don't, because when a daughter marries, she's bringing with her a dowry. She's taking stuff out of the family, right? Well, if that happens to this daughter here, for example, who's going to marry a male cousin, then she's keeping that in the family. And especially if you've got a couple of different cousins that are marrying, you can consolidate the property instead of losing it to some other family. All right? The church, however, frowned upon that, and the result is that it had the effect of limiting heir production. What that means is it was difficult for some people to find a spouse. Think about this. You're living in, does anyone come from a small village? How many people live in? 200. How many people? About 1,000. Okay. Well, you can imagine a community the size of 200. I mean, and it's different now. I mean, I don't know. Are there a lot of people who are related in your village, cousins and whatnot?
Probably is.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I'm not from there, so I've moved into it.
Okay.
Probably is.
All right. But imagine 1,000 years ago, a small village like that somewhere. Chances are a lot of people are going to be related. So if the degrees of incest are 7 degrees, it's going to be difficult. It might be difficult to find someone around who's not related to you within 7 degrees, right? If you can't find a marriage partner and you inherit some property from your family, what are you going to do with the property after you die? Where might it go? What do people do when they die and they've got a bunch of property? Leave a will, yeah. So you're going to give some property to different groups, right? Think about a society that's profoundly Christian. It's likely that you're going to give a lot of your property to the church. Okay? Now, the scholar who's identified all this stuff is a scholar named Jack Goody. He kind of developed this argument. And he did not say that the church developed incest laws in order to make it difficult for people to marry so that they could acquire the property. But he said it's kind of one of the effects that these laws ended up having, that people ended up giving property to the church. Anyway, the point that I want to make through this exercise is that you see that the church is acting as a kind of a balance, as a kind of a counterbalance to these heads of the household that are just thinking about their family power. Okay, so the church is kind of a structural obstacle. So one question that we can ask ourselves is what happens when the church is removed from the picture? When these incest rules and these other kinds of rules are no longer applying, people are not concerned about fathers lose the ability to prevent clandestine marriage and so on. You know, what kind of breaks are there? So we can hold that question in our mind, and we'll come back to it. I wanted to just do a quick case study about the Medici family, which is a family that came from Tuscany. Originally, they came from an agricultural area north of Florence called the Mugello. They became involved in trading wool. Some of their members moved to Florence in the Middle Ages. By the early 1300s, some family members became involved in politics in the city of Florence. By the late 1300s, a member of the family named Salvestro was elected speaker of the Woolmakers Guild, So there were, have you guys heard that word before, guild? A guild in the medieval and early modern period is a kind of it's an organization made up of people involved in a certain line of economic activity in cities. So the wool makers would have been both the wool workers, also the people who owned the wool manufacturing place, and then you might have the wool traders who are a separate guild. Okay, so they're economic corporations that involve, when we think about it today in our terms, it involves both labor and management. Okay, they're working together. So he became involved in this, one of the members of this family was the speaker of the wool makers guild, which was an important position. And through marriages during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, this family, the Medici, increased their power. Salvestro married a woman named Lisa Donati, who was from a leading mercantile family in Florence, and it was also important throughout Italy, a family of merchants. And their son, a guy named Averardo, married a woman named Giovanna degli Spini. And this is the palace of Giovanna degli Spini's family in Florence. And you can see how it was an imposing edifice, has some defensive crenellations around the top, a big palace. And this was a leading family in Florence, one of the wealthiest families in Florence. So by the end of the 1300s, the Medici had really established themselves. The son of the degli Spini woman and Averardo Medici was named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, and he's the one who founded the Medici Bank. The Medici family became important as bankers. So they went from wool trading and manufacturing into banking, which was a typical kind of course of movement of families. First you make money trading, and then you've got all these profits, and then you lend out the money and make even more money. So Giovanni di Bicci founded this Medici Bank. One of the reasons why the bank was so successful is that they developed close relations with the papacy and became bankers to the popes. They lent money to the papacy, and in return for lending money to the papacy, they're able to collect taxes from papal lands. So they became, again, one of the leading families in Florence, but they were a new family in Florence. There were other families in Florence, like the degli Spini, who had been around longer. And so already there are some tensions between the Medici, this new up-and-coming family, and other more established families. So the wealth of the Medici family made some other key families in Florence nervous. One of the reasons is because the Medici had so much money that when the city of Florence went into debt because of wars that it was fighting against another city called Pisa. Have you guys heard of Pisa? What's in Pisa that's famous? The Leaning Tower, right? So Florence was fighting with Pisa in the early 1400s, and they were spending all their money, Florence was, on war. And so they went into debt. And the only family that could really help them out was the Medici, because they had enough cash. So they were dependent on the Medici, and this made them nervous about being dependent on the Medici. So they ended up exiling the Medici family from Florence. They said, you can't come here anymore. You have to leave the city because we don't want you to kind of assert your domination. Well, eventually they did come back under the leadership of Cosimo il Vecchio, which means the older. And the Medici family basically seized power in 1434. This Cosimo il Vecchio married a countess. So it was the first marriage into really a member of the nobility. And from that point on in the 1400s, this was the high point of the Renaissance in Florence. The family basically dominated politics, and thanks in large part to their marriage connections. And I want to, well, let me make this other point. They continued alliances with other key Florentine and Italian families, and then eventually, in the 1500s, they won a princely title the emperor made them Dukes of Florence. And once they were dukes, once they had this title, that opened the door to marriages with other ruling families in Europe, like the French royal family, or the emperor's own family, or German princely families. And so in the 1500s, they were able to operate these marriage alliances on an even greater international stage. But I wanted just to look briefly at a source here, and then I'll come back and say a couple things about the Renaissance, if we have time. Do you guys know when I talk about a primary source? In your you're all doing history presumably for A levels, right? Have you talked about the difference between primary and secondary sources? Yeah. Okay. Anyone want to take a stab at what a primary source is? Yeah, that's right. Good. So a primary source is evidence produced during the time period that you're studying. And a secondary source is what some other historian has written about it. So here we've got a primary source. It's from a diary of a Florentine man, Bartolomeo Valori, and there's two different entries here from different times. And we can look at it really briefly. He says, I record this event that on July 15th, 1452, Niccolo di Piero Capponi sent for me, and after many circumlocutions, he asked me if I were still in a mood to marry. I told him that I would not diverge from his judgment in this matter or in any other, for I had great faith in him and was certain that his advice would be prudent and honest. So he told me that Piero di Messer Andrea de' Pazzi had two nubile daughters and that he was willing to give me the girl which I preferred. He was making this offer to me on Piero's behalf. I accepted the bait willingly and asked for 2 days' grace to confer with several of my relatives, which I did extensively, and was advised by them to proceed. After 2 days, I returned to Niccolo and told him to ask Piero's consent to marry the eldest, whom I knew very well, for up to the age of 12, we were practically raised together. And then the editor inserts, for a dowry, Bartolomeo received 14,000 florins of communal bonds, valued at 2,000 florins. His wife, Caterina, died on November 20th, 1474, leaving 2 boys and 6 girls. So then the next entry from 1476. On this day, July 5th, 1476, Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, and this Lorenzo de' Medici is the grandson of Cosimo il Vecchio. So he's one of the Medici who's ruling basically the city of Florence. Told me that he wanted to speak to me, and I visited him immediately. He said that Averardo d'Alamanno Salviati had come to see him and told him that he had a daughter of marriageable age, that he would willingly give her to my son Filippo, requesting that Lorenzo be the broker. I replied that this pleased me, but that I wished first to speak to Filippo to learn his views, which I did that same evening. Finding my son disposed to follow my judgment and my will, on the next day I asked Lorenzo to conclude the business. He sent for Averardo and they agreed on the conditions. On July 7th, Lorenzo came to my house and told me that the alliance was sealed, that Alessandra, the daughter of Averardo Salviati, would be the wife of my son Filippo with a dowry of 2,000 florins. And we formally sealed the agreement in the palace of the Signoria, which was like the city hall of Florence, with Lorenzo himself pronouncing the details of the settlement. So, a couple of diary entries dealing with marriage alliances in 15th century Florence. Does anything catch your attention here? Are there any questions you have about it? Is there something that someone didn't understand here? Or what catches your attention? Yeah, go ahead.
How he visited him like immediately when he said just immediately, it just sort of shows the power of the other guy.
Oh yeah, okay, good. So he heard word that Lorenzo wanted to talk to him, and right away he was there. Okay, good, yeah. Well, what else is interesting about that? Were you going to say something? No? About Lorenzo's involvement, do you think? Maybe just that he's involved, right? That he wants to be involved in helping to set up this marriage tie between Valori on the one hand, and this other family, the Salviati, on the other hand. He's engaged in that. Which I think is important because it shows us that not only were the Medici themselves concerned about their own marriage partners, they wanted to have good alliances for themselves, they also wanted to see certain alliances take place within Florence between other families, alliances that would be beneficial for them. Interestingly, this family, the Pazzi, we see that Valori marries someone from the Pazzi, right? So Valori's son Filippo, his mother was a Pazzi, so he's half Pazzi, right? In that sense. The Pazzi were big rivals of the Medici. And in fact, 2 years after this, there was a conspiracy, and two Pazzi brothers attacked Lorenzo while he was at Mass in church and killed his brother, Lorenzo's brother. So the Pazzi revolt. So one wonders whether Lorenzo is thinking, I want to make sure that these people connected to the Pazzi come over to my side and become my supporters, and I'm going to use marriage as a way to do that. I want to make sure that this Filippo Valori, whose mother was a Pazzi, marries with the Salviati so that he can be part of one of my supporters. All right, I think we have about 5 minutes left. This is an image of one of the Medici, one of the women who marries into the Medici family, Eleonora de Toledo, who was a Spanish noblewoman who married Cosimo I de' Medici in 1539. So it's a famous painting by Bronzino, in part because of the sumptuousness of her dress. You can see that she's wearing pearls, and there are pearls that are encrusted in the dress up here. And you can see the tissue obviously would have been extremely expensive. And another thing that they did with dresses during this period is they used gold thread and silver thread in order to sew the dresses. So one of the things that's interesting about the portrait is just the magnificence that it details with respect to the dress. All right, I want to close here by saying something about the Enlightenment, how things change in the 18th century. So obviously marrying for wealth was not a new idea in the Enlightenment, even though sometimes we find propaganda in the 1700s that kind of makes fun of noblemen who are marrying women who are from families that aren't as prestigious. But as we've seen, that has happened for a long time. In fact, some scholars suggest that by the late 18th and early 19th century, what was happening was not mismatched marriages between noble families with influence but no money and middle-class families with money but no influence, that was not the trend. One scholar named David Sabian has shown that in a town that he studied in early 18th century, there were actually a lot of kinship ties between families on different social levels. That marriage in this place that he studied called Neckarhausen happened, and other kinds of ties happened between families of different social statuses, and this had the effect of creating a sense of shared interests in local society. The people in the community felt like they were connected. But he says this changed by about 1800 as wealthy families started to only marry amongst themselves. And he sees this explosion of cousin marriage, in fact, in different places in Germany by about 1800 and into the early 19th century. That's what we mean by social endogamy, a social group that only marries other people from the same social group. Okay? This had the effect of creating a new wealthy elite, because the people with money and property and influence are only marrying each other. So you have this elite that consolidates itself, and it's a new thing, he says, in Neckarhausen. However, the consolidation of this new elite class was hidden, he says. It was something that was masked. It was kind of not, it was kept in the, people were kept in the dark about it in a way, and it was hidden by a couple of different things. One is ideas about individualism. So in the early 1900s, people developed this notion that we're marrying for love, But he says it just so happens that the people who loved each other tended to be people from the same social class who had the same kinds of backgrounds and the same kinds of wealth levels. But that idea about individualism, which is one thing that hid this creation of this new elite. He says there was propaganda, or I'm sorry, not he, but it's also true that there was propaganda that ridiculed mismatched marriages during the period, and that's another thing that kept this hidden. And then the last thing that's important is that women had always been really involved in arranging these marriages. In the case that we saw with Lorenzo de' Medici and Bartolomeo Valori, it was men who were doing the brokering. But often in Neckarhausen, it was women who were helping to arrange these marriages. And one of the things that happened in the early 19th century was a separation of something that we call the public sphere, what's public, versus the private sphere. And women were said to be part of this private sphere. This is the last point that I'm going to make, and then I'll let you go. Women were part of this private sphere, so-called private sphere. Okay? And since they were the ones arranging the marriages, people imagined that marriage arrangement was not something that was political because it was private. In fact, Sabian says, it was very political, as we've seen over the last 45 minutes. But by creating a public sphere and a private sphere and imagining that the private sphere doesn't have to do with politics, that helped hide the fact that women actually played a key role in politics by helping to create these marriage matches that brought this new class into being. And here you see a picture of people playing croquet. There was this big croquet craze in the early 1800s, which is interesting because that's the kind of event where men and women from different social groups, from the same social group, could get to know each other. Going to the opera, going to the play, playing croquet, having tea. They could court in those kinds of circumstances. All right, any questions about this? At least gives you a taste of some of the kind of work that some people in the department are doing. And hopefully you learned something new about politics and families. Does anyone have anything? Okay. I release you. Have a good day.